So today, we are continuing in our series on examining love. And in 1983, Pat Benatar had a chart-topping song called Love is a Battlefield. And in our studies here, we're making sure that we are using the right weapons. Because this is a battle that our souls can't afford to lose. In this study, we're seeking to deepen not only our doctrinal understanding of love, but also how to shape our hearts so that we don't only know it, we can't just provide a book, chapter, verse, but that we actually internalize these character attributes, that they become a way of life and not just a reference. And so, as we like to do, as I like to do, maybe you guys hate it, I like to do just a quick recap of what we've covered thus far to kind of help set the stage for us to move forward and to remind us of the attributes. I think that repetition is the mother of learning. My Hebrew professor tells me that. If I just say the Hebrew words enough times, eventually I'll learn it. So far it's not working out for me, but hopefully for our lessons this is beneficial to you to see these every week. So we started out and we looked at the fact that this common phrase that love is love, not a very good phrase because it leads us to believe that love is this ambiguous concept that everybody can define for themselves. But we know that that's not true, that love has concrete value, it has concrete principles, that we can know what it is, that it does have objective meaning, and it can be emulated correctly. Then we considered what Paul meant when he said love is the greatest. Without love, there could be no such thing as forgiveness. We could not have salvation. We could not have faith. We could not have hope. Love is the source of our life. Then we considered how when we show patience towards others, we are in fact showing them God's love. In like manner, when we show kindness to others, we are in fact showing them God's love. And then we started looking at some of the negative attributes, some of the things that love is not. And we started off by considering the role that jealousy plays and how that takes away from our ability to love others. In a broad sense, jealousy is spiritually unfruitful desires. Jealousy is when we want things that distract us from God's goodness and God's purpose in our life. Oftentimes when we think of jealousy, we can think that, well, other people are so great that I want to be like them. And then from there we turn to boasting. That boasting and love are incompatible. Love does not crave attention from others. When we are boastful, what we are saying to the people around us is that, hey, I am so great that you should want to be like me. And there's no place for that type of boasting and that type of arrogance in a Christian life and in love. And before we get into today's topic, I want to cover two important things. And the first one is I want to propose a little analogy. I'm a very visual person, and I've been trying to come up with an analogy of how to understand some of these principles a little bit better. It's helping me. Maybe it'll help you. It's why I wanted to share it. So I thought of this concept of a tree of anti-loves. And we can think about having a dead faith or having a tree that produces no fruit. And what type of tree would that look like? And I like to think that these characteristics that Paul is covering in this section, where he's talking about all the things that love is not, are evidences and can be likened to a dead tree. And in the adult Bible class, we closed with the question of pride, which is our topic of study for today, and whether pride is the source of all other sins. And kind of throughout Christian tradition, as I was reading up on pride, the vast majority of all the sources that I was reading from, everybody attributes pride as the greatest sin. because it is pride which hardens your heart and causes you to do all these other things. And maybe you agree with that. And there's nothing wrong with thinking that way. If that's what helps you understand the dangers and consequences of pride, by all means, continue thinking pride is the absolute worst. I'm not telling you to not think that. But what has helped me is considering that perhaps jealousy is, in fact, the root of all of our sinful behaviors. When we understand jealousy from its broadest sense of not just, well, Jeremy, I really like your shoes, and I want those shoes. Right? When we broaden that out to jealousy is those types of unfruitful desires, those immoral passions, those things that we shouldn't be wanting in the first place. I think that desire is what provides the toxic soil from which everything else dies from. Because when we want the attention of others, we are jealous for the attention of others. We crave it, we desire it, and therefore we boast and hope to get it. And then as we will see with pride, pride is when we are the ones that we think that we are always right. And we want to be right. And we don't want to consider the opinions of others. And it's because of our desire to lift ourselves up and to elevate our own thoughts and our own opinions and our own desires above others, that is what leads to pride. So maybe it's helpful to you, maybe not, but I'm going to add to this every week unless I decide to change it up on you and give you something else to think about. But for now, this is an analogy that's helping me understand sins in our life, is to think about, does this, whatever I want, whatever action I'm about to take, whatever words I'm about to say, is it coming from a foundation of an unlawful or an immoral or an unscriptural desire? To me, that type of desire is the broad form of jealousy. And now the second thing I want to cover is I want to revisit this slide from last week. And the reason I want to visit it is because as we say at the beginning of every single one of these sermons, our intention in this study is to help morph our hearts into having godly desires. And when I was reflecting on the way that I presented last week's sermon, I wasn't entirely happy with it. And I don't know if I necessarily conveyed the message against boasting in maybe the most fruitful way to help us understand. So I wanted to revisit this slide, because when we talk about boasting and pride, which are very, very closely related, a lot of times it becomes difficult to see exactly when it becomes sinful. Because as we have talked about for 2 weeks now, these issues are matters of the heart. Right? We don't always know the motivations that other people have. Are they acting pridefully? Are they acting in a boastful manner? Or are they just happy and they're just rejoicing and they're just celebrating God's blessings? And the purpose of our studies here is not to help us become better judges of other people, but to help us ensure that our hearts are right. And so instead of looking at just hypothetical examples, I wanted to provide one scriptural example for understanding what I call the stoplight of boasting, and I'll extend that to the stoplight of pride. So if you would, turn to Luke 14. Luke 14, and we will be starting with verse 12 through 14. Luke 14, verses 12 through 14. And he, Jesus, also went on to say to the one who had invited him, Jesus is at a dinner party right now. He was invited to come have dinner, and there's plenty of guests all around. And Jesus says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. So he's saying, don't invite other people who are going to repay the favor. And then he goes on, but when you give a reception, when you host a dinner party, you should invite the poor, invite the crippled, invite the lame, invite the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And so what Jesus is saying here is he is attacking a common cultural practice of the time, in which people would host these dinner parties, and their motivation for hosting them was to elevate their own social status. They're trying to put it in kind of like today's language. We talked about social media and the ways that social media can be abused this morning, and how many people, when they get on social media, what they are doing is they are posting pictures or videos or what have you for the sole purpose of gaining followers, of getting likes. And that is their reason for existing, is how popular can I become? I need to get 100 likes. I need to get 1,000 likes because I want people to like me. And that's their motivation. That was a common motivation during the first century times for when you would do things like hosting a dinner party. And Jesus, he's saying, if you want to hold a party, if you want to have guests over for dinner, hey, that's great. But let me tell you the right motivation to have when you do that. How about you seek to invite people that in no possible way can they actually repay you? Because you're not going to get popular when all of the cripples show up, because those are the outcasts of society. None of that. Don't host a dinner party. Don't do it. Because you're doing it with sinful desires. However, yellow light, intersection, dinner party, if your desires for doing that are because you want to share God's blessings with others. You've got a nice home. You have a good roof over your head. You've got plenty of food to go around and to share. And so you want to share God's blessings with the people that are around you because you want to elevate them. I've got all these great things. I want you to share these great things with me. Not because I want the attention, but because I want to give you encouragement, and I want to share God's blessings so that they can be blessings in your life as well. You want to do that? Green light, pedal to the metal, blow through that intersection. Go right ahead. A quote that I shared last week, and I think it rings true, and it applies to pride, absolutely, in the same way. Loving other people does not mean failing to acknowledge the good that God has done in oneself and others. Love does not mean lying about human accomplishments. Rather, it means not exalting ourselves over others as if our accomplishments were based on our own merit and ability. In our pursuit to not be boastful and not be prideful, we need to be extremely cautious about using that as an excuse to not celebrate the good things that God has given us. It is absolutely good for us to share God's blessings and to celebrate in those blessings, so long as we do it with a heart that seeks to give Him glory and to elevate others up with us. And so, with that general rule in mind, we'll move on. We're going to talk about pride. And so I found this joke I was cracking up. Megan probably heard me laughing when I was in my little office last night finishing up this lesson. And so church service is going on, and everything's going really well, and then it wraps up, closes, everybody does their socializing afterwards, and then everybody leaves. However, there's one woman who's still sitting on her pew, and she is obviously distraught. She looks very deeply concerned. And so the minister, he goes up to her, and he says, I'll just, let's see, trying to come up with a name. Let's say Elizabeth, give her a name that I don't think anybody in here has, Elizabeth. And says, so Elizabeth, what's going on? You obviously look troubled. Is there something that I can help you with? Can I pray for you? What's going on? And so Elizabeth, she looks up and she says, well, preacher, I realized today, during our worship service, just how sinful I am. and that I've got some major problems in my life, specifically one that I was made aware of today that I don't know how to overcome, and I just need your help. And he said, well, absolutely. What's going on? And so Elizabeth says, well, as I was looking around during our worship service today, I realized that I am the most beautiful woman in attendance. There is no one that can even come close to comparing to my beauty. And I know that's prideful, but I don't know how to get over that. And the preacher, he kind of perks up and he says, Elizabeth, that's not sin. You're just mistaken. Yeah, give me some good chuckles too. So, when we look at the way that Paul describes pride here, the word that he uses is phusiutai. Some of these words are hard to pronounce. And the core of this word is an inflated view of the self. We can contrast pride and boasting when we think of it this way. When we are boastful, we want others to think that we're amazing. When we're prideful, we know we're amazing. It's a nuanced difference, but hopefully you can appreciate that there is a nuanced difference there. Boasting is about that, as we said last week, an anxiousness to impress others, whereas pride is, you already know you're the best. Whether you impress other people or not, you don't care because I know I'm great. And I know how good I am. That is pride. It is this inflated view of oneself. And with that, it comes with an attitude of superiority and insubordination. It is a prideful attitude that believes that it can do no wrong. That I'm always right. That there's nothing that you can do to improve my life because I am all that. Now, pride is not the same thing as being confident, which is something that we're going to see in some examples here momentarily. Next slide, as always, what about God's pride, right? We want to understand God's character. Well, there's a problem here. And it's the same problem we ran into last week when we talked about boasting. And we looked at this passage in Job. The problem here is that God, it's logically impossible for God to have pride in the same way that man is warned against having pride. And the reason is because pride is that overestimation of oneself, but God is all-knowing, and he is all-powerful, and he is also all-loving. In the way that pride is sinful for us, it's literally impossible for God to be prideful. He can't elevate himself up any higher. He can't have an overinflated view of himself. He simply just is. And the closest thing that we have to seeing any connotation of pride from God is in the speech which he gives to Job. But even in those speeches where God is kind of going through kind of like a checklist resume of all the powerful things that he has done, it would be us reading into the text a little too much if when we read those passages we assume that there is this arrogant voice raining down from heaven. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. I don't know. But we do know that the reason that God is kind of giving this background of, Job, look at all these things I've done, is to encourage Job to continue trusting in God. Even when God doesn't give us all the answers, even when we don't have perfect understanding for problems in this life, will we still trust God because we have seen and know how powerful and how loving he is? So we can't really use God's quote-unquote pride as a way to understand our own because it's not possible for God to have that kind of pride. However, he does show humility, which is the opposite of pride. That is having a lower view of oneself. And we see that in the life of Jesus. When we try to understand our pride, I think it's valuable to consider some of the ways that we can see pride in our world today. The common Hebrew expression would be, and 6 ways of being prideful, and then a 7th. Meaning that this is not an exhaustive list. These were just a few things that I kind of thought of as ways that we can show pride in order to get our gears spinning when we leave this building, when we go out into the world, we have to consider, maybe we're guilty of being prideful in some of these things. We can be prideful in our race or ethnicity when we think that, well, because I look this way or belong to this nationality, I'm automatically better than other people. Not good. Not good to think that. In like manner, we can have pride in our wealth, in our accumulation, in our economic status. We can think that, well, because I have more stuff, that means I'm better than other people. What about our peer groups in our social life, the people that we hang out with? I know that I'm not too old yet, but I can't remember the school days. And I remember how cliquey middle school and high school was. Maybe that's not the case for you guys, but I remember there were certain groups of friends, and right, there was always that, like, the cool kids group, right? Sometimes there were multiple. Here's the sports group, here's the band group, here's the choir group. You always have all these different groups. And a lot of times, depending on which friend group you're with, you think that you're better than other people because you're in the in crowd, right? That is being prideful. What about intellect or knowledge? This is one of the things that scriptures warn most frequently about in terms of pride, is not being prideful in your own wisdom. There's several proverbs that warn of this. Even Paul warns of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. So we back up a few chapters from our source text, and Paul is directly criticizing the fact that those Christians in Corinth, they were being prideful in their newfound wisdom of the gospel. And they were using that to exalt themselves above others. And Paul is having to correct that attitude. I think of one example in recent times of this elevated sense of wisdom when I think about the responses to COVID over the past couple years. And it's been going on long enough now that we can see that there has been pride on both sides, where we have doctors who, because of their professional degrees and experiences, have come out and said, well, I'm a doctor, and because I'm a doctor, I know for a fact that this is the worst virus that there's ever been. But then on the other hand, you've got doctors who say, well, I'm a doctor, and I'm a medical professional, and I've been studying diseases for X number of years, and I can say without hesitation that this virus is nothing, barely above the common flu. And we see that these medical professionals that spoke out with those extremes and in those ways, a lot of times their voices were based in their own pride and their intellect, and not based on surveying the evidence. And we talk about confidence. I would want a surgeon. I had heart surgery back in high school. I would want my heart surgeon to be confident in his abilities to perform the operation, right? But I would not want him so overly prideful in his abilities that he thinks he can show up on 0 hours of sleep, having knocked back, a case of beer the night before, and thinking that he can perform this operation flawlessly on me the next morning because, well, I'm so great that, I don't need sleep, and I'm so great that I can do this drunk. I would not want that kind of pride in my doctor. Right? So we can see a little bit of a difference here. We see that with skills and abilities. We wouldn't want our electrician to be so prideful in his abilities that he electrocutes himself on the side of the garage. I say that because our electrician just finished our work on our garage, and he does a great job. He's very confident in his abilities, but he is extremely humble. Eric Ryland, if anybody, you got Jordan here. You're a specialty electrician, so maybe don't get a hold of Eric. But for the Breda area, Eric Ryland, he does a fantastic job. He's very humble in his work. But we see that we can take pride in our physical strength. We see that we can take pride in our physical appearance. And maybe you guys can think of more ways and in more reasons to show pride. But we need to consider the consequences of pride. And so the first consequence that we need to consider is that it leads to destruction. In Proverbs 16, verses 18 through 19, we read that from the adult Bible class this morning. But it warns that pride comes before destruction. And so from a theological perspective, we can know that pride is a sin that if we don't repent of, that we will be, quote unquote, destroyed in the final judgment. But in a very real, practical, down-to-earth sense, pride oftentimes does lead to destruction. I'm going to share this article with you. In 1986, sailing the Black Sea out in Eastern Europe, a Russian cruise ship and a cargo ship collide. Over 400 people died. There was a big investigation that went into it. How is it possible that this massive cruise ship and this massive cargo ship could collide? Didn't they see each other? Were the captains not communicating with each other? And the best determination that could be found was that pride was to blame for this collision. You see, both captains thought that they were in the right. Both captains thought that they had the correct course heading. Neither captain thought to communicate with the other and to double-check their direction on their compass and on their charts. They had a self-inflated view of their own capabilities. The one captain specifically, after confirming with his, I don't know maybe terminology, but the dude who spins the wheel, after consulting with him, he said, "Yep, continue, straight ahead. No worries, we're going to miss that cargo ship." And the captain then retired to his quarters to take a nap. And then minutes later, 400 people are drowning in the sea. Pride was to blame for the loss of those lives. When we are overly confident in our abilities and in our knowledge, we tend to make mistakes quite quickly and frequently, and it can lead to real disaster. Number 2, pride leads to hardened hearts. If you want to turn to Luke 16, 19 through 31, Jesus gives the famous account. Some people call it a parable. Some people say that Jesus is using a very accurate real-life illustration. I think that Jesus is giving a real-life illustration, but even if it is a parable, Jesus has never expressed a false truth in a parable. So the lessons that we can learn from it are still true, whether the exact events are historical or not. But I think they are. And we see that in Luke 16, it's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus, the poor beggar on the rich man's doorstep. And they both die. And you got Lazarus who's in Abraham's bosom in the place of waiting. We did a sermon on that a few months ago. There's this realm called Tartarus, the waiting place, where our souls go to wait final judgment. And those of us that are in a right relationship with God, we go to what's referred to here as Abraham's bosom. It is a place of peace and a place of rest. But those of us that have lived lives disobedient to God, they go to the side of this place that is most commonly referred to as Hades. And it's a place where we know what's coming for us. It is a place where we see the rich man. He is suffering from intense heat and intense thirst. And he knows that when that final judgment comes, that he's going to an even worse place, that he'll be going to hell. And we can see how pride has blackened his soul to the point that while waiting for that final judgment, while in Hades, just in agony with heat and thirst, he shows no sign of remorse. He shows no sign of repentance. When he refers to Lazarus, he still considers Lazarus as nothing more than an errand boy. There is no request for forgiveness. There is no admission of mistake. The best that we see from him is, you know what? I don't want my family to be here with me. Could you send somebody down as a messenger? Could you send Lazarus down to go warn my family? And Abraham's response is, your family has the same opportunity that you did. Just as you could have listened to the prophets, just as you could have obeyed the scriptures, but chose not to, your family has the same choice. And Lazarus coming back from the dead to tell them isn't going to change their mind. Because just like you, if you didn't listen to the prophets, why would you listen to a ghost? We see that pride hardens our hearts to the point that we do not seek repentance. And I recently finished a book titled Why Does God Allow Evil by Clay Jones. And in that book, he asserts that our souls, after we die in this life, whatever character we possess now is what we'll possess in the afterlife. So if we are repentant now, and we have hearts that seek to obey God, then we will seek to continually obey God in the afterlife. But if now we have hearts that seek to disobey God, that puff ourselves up into thinking that we are incapable of being wrong, we're still going to have that type of heart. Now, it's a topic that I want to do a little bit deeper study on, to have a better understanding, to see if maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong on that. But at a very basic value, I think there is something to be said for that principle. And that principle is steeped in pride. It prevents our spiritual growth. Pride prevents us from being able to admit mistakes and to confess our sins. And then a third way that pride can ruin our lives is that it can ruin our relationships. And I already mentioned 1 Corinthians chapter 8, when Paul is chastising the Corinthians for their pridefulness in their newfound wisdom of the gospel. Specifically, Paul is discussing how they are now thinking that, hey, I'm a Christian, which means I don't believe in pagan gods, I don't believe in pagan idols, so if there is some meat in the marketplace that had been offered up to a pagan god, I don't have to worry about eating that meat because I know that it doesn't do anything. Like that idol, that false god does not possess this meat, and by me eating it, I am not therefore giving credit to that God. I can still thank the one true God for this food, for this meat, even if it had previously been offered to an idol. The problem is, there were Christians and non-believers in the bunch who still didn't have a good understanding of that principle. And Paul says, don't lift your own wisdom up to the point that you are hurting your brother. If this is a topic that they are concerned about, then just don't eat meat. If it is going to cause their own soul torment because they have a hard time understanding this teaching, then just go vegetarian for a while. Paul says, I'll never eat meat again if it means helping someone else's faith. Don't think of yourselves as so prideful that you forget to help your brother who might be struggling with an issue. And in this way, our pride can ruin our relationships. When we think about our friendships, when we think about our families, when we think about our relationship with our children or with our spouses, when we think that we can't be corrected, that we are always right, that we are the superior one, how quickly will those relationships falter? So, we need to figure out a way to strike a balance here. Because as I mentioned before, there's a difference between having pride and having confidence. And some Christians will go so far to condemn pride that the only option that remains is self-deprecation, where we constantly put ourselves down. Well, I don't want to be prideful, so I'll just continually insult myself to remind myself of how lowly I am and how worthless I am. I'm just going to fill myself with shame and with doubt and with insecurity. But that would be going too far in the other direction. Because it neglects the fact that God created each of us with unique and precious value, each with a purpose in this life. It also neglects the commandment that we have to encourage one another, to build one another up. And Paul himself, when he writes to the church in Colossae, he remarks that having severity of body, or treating your body severely so as to not take pride in the pleasures of life, he says that type of severe treatment is of no value. Because our hope is in the spiritual, our hope is in the afterlife. And just because you want to abuse your body doesn't mean you're actually helping the cause of the faith. And so the way that I think about this balance is I like to compare it to tire pressure. So I want you to think about the tires on your car, And what happens if you have one tire that is underinflated? And what happens if that same tire is overinflated? And what the result is? You see, if we have a tire that is underinflated, it's deflated, it's low on air pressure, it causes the whole car to vibrate and to shake. The bumps in the road are a lot rougher, and it can cause damage to the wheels and to the suspension. And it can cause the tire to blow out much sooner. Well, that self-deprecating person is much in this way. This constant negativity, this constant putting themselves down is going to lead to depression, to anxiety. It's going to bring the morale and the health of everyone else down too, because if you always have a negative outlook on life, you as a Christian who has that eternal hope, if you're the negative person, what hope does that leave the rest of the world? But then we can also have an overinflated tire, which has a lot of the same problems. If you have one tire that's overinflated, it causes vibrations, it causes shaking, bumps in the road are really bumpy. It's not good on the suspension, and the tire is going to blow out faster. A prideful person is much this way. Because they think they're bigger and better than everyone else, it's trying to do a little bit more work, trying to work harder, it's going to burn out, and it's going to hurt the rest of us. It's going to hurt everyone, much like those captains from the boats. And so, by way of comparison, this is a common problem in any type of setting where type A personalities are predominant, such as I mentioned in the adult Bible class. We look at soldiers, especially we look at infantry soldiers, where pride is a common problem because they are the ones that are out there on the front lines day in and day out, fighting the hardest, the longest battles, having to endure gunshots and explosions, having to face a very real threat every single day. And it is an even harder balance for them to walk between maintaining confidence in your own skills versus not being so prideful in those skills that you begin to think of others as inferior to you. It's easy for them to have an overinflated sense of self. And that becomes evident when these soldiers come home from deployments and they begin struggling with a lot of issues. And suicide is very high in the military. And it's highest of all among those infantry soldiers who, because they're so used to being the best, I have to be the best, I can't afford to make mistakes, that when they come home and they try to reintegrate with their families, and they feel like they can't control the situation anymore. They feel like they've lost control. And when they feel like they've lost that control is when mentally they just blow up and can't take it anymore. And we can see the very real danger of having that overinflated view of self. And we see that whether too much pressure or too little, both of them cause harm to the self and can bring the overall health of a congregation, of a church family down. But a properly inflated tire, it shares the load equally with all the other tires. It can accomplish the job without wearing out, and it can withstand all those bumps in the road. This is a confident person. And I think where we can find confidence, we can read a passage of that in Hebrews chapter 10, if you would turn there. Hebrews chapter 10, 35 and 36. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Confidence is a good thing, because confidence is what keeps us focused on our goal. Confidence keeps us encouraged that God does have a purpose in our life, that God has given us the blessings and the strength that we need to achieve that purpose. Confidence is what gives us the courage and the strength to lift others up when they're struggling. Confidence, when placed in God, can never be shaken and never be taken away. Which brings us to our final slide here. when we think about how do we fix pride in our lives. Well, first, I want us to remember that God sees our heart. This passage from 1 Samuel, chapter 16. When God sends out Samuel to find a new king, because Saul has betrayed God and failed God too many times, and he's leading the people into destruction, God tells Samuel, his prophet, to go find a new king. And when Samuel goes out to David's family, Samuel sees some of David's brothers. And some of David's older brothers, boy, they were men. They were soldiers. And Samuel says, surely this is the new king. And God says, hold up there, Samuel. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. We can take great encouragement in this. That it doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter how strong you are. What matters to God is, do you have a humble and obedient heart? That is what God desires above all else. Secondly, we can consider the pride of being an apostle that Paul uses as an example in chapter 4. Paul is trying to encourage the Corinthians to abandon their pride, and to do so, what he says is, look at the apostles. Look at what we've been through. Tell me if this sounds like pride to you. Because to the world, we as apostles, we are viewed as foolish, we're made weak, we are held in disrepute, we are hungry, we are thirsty, we have shabby clothes, we are often beaten, we're often homeless, we work tirelessly, we are reviled and persecuted. We're spoken evilly of. We're treated as garbage. Does that sound like something to take pride in? And Paul uses this as an example to remind the church in Corinth that those that are the lowliest of servants are the hardest workers for God. The hardest workers for God are those lowliest of servants. It's not about how great you are. It's about how much you serve and how much you're willing to endure. Third, remember that pride shares in the fate of Satan. In 1 Timothy 3:6, when Paul is talking about how that we are to identify Christian leadership, he warns that a Christian leader for a congregation should not be a recent convert, lest in being put in a position of authority, he himself becomes prideful and then falls into the same trap that Satan fell, of pride, of thinking that you are better than others in the same way that Satan thought that he knew better than God. And a person who lifts himself up in that manner will receive the same reward that Satan does, and that is condemnation. And then lastly, as always, we have to remember Christ's example. In John chapter 13, verses 12 through 16. This is the night that Jesus was betrayed. This is the night that Jesus was to be arrested, leading up to his crucifixion. And it is on this night that Jesus was very intentional about washing his disciples' feet. Something he absolutely did not have to do. They were already there in the house. This was something he kind of broke custom. Usually when you come into a house, you wash your feet as you're coming in. And the way that this would typically happen is the host of the house would set out a basin of water at the door for you to wash your feet as you came in. Jesus makes a very intentional point about washing his disciples' feet after that had already happened. And foot washing was a very lowly thing to do. Most people were to wash their own feet, and the only persons that ever washed someone else's feet were like the lowest of the slaves. It was like if you had a servant who you really didn't like, that's my least favorite servant, that's the person who's going to wash your feet. And Peter tries to tell Jesus, no, don't wash my feet. And Jesus says, no, I need to do this because I need to show you the example of how you are to serve one another. That the most lowly act that you can think of, if it is a good service for your brother, you are to do that. on the night that he was to be arrested, there is no example or hint of any form of pride from Jesus. Nothing but humble submission to his Father's plan, but also to his disciples to teach them a spirit of humility. In conclusion, love is not proud. Pride has no dealings with repentance or obedience. Pride does not seek forgiveness, nor does it give forgiveness. Pride seeks only for itself. In our pursuit to love one another, in our pursuit to teach the world what love looks like, there is no room for pride in our lives. When we control our prideful ambitions, when we don't think of ourselves as better than other people, but when we think of ourselves as servants, that is when we show God's love. Now, if you have had or are struggling with a prideful heart, and you've been refusing to yield to God's commands, you've been refusing to repent of the sins in your life, I would encourage you, I think I speak for the congregation, that we would encourage you to let us know those needs. Let us know those struggles. Let us know how we can pray with you, how we can support you. Don't waste this opportunity. So if you need the prayers of the church, if you need some counsel, if you just need some support in general, if you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, whatever the case may be, we ask that you would let us know before you leave here today.